Hey there, this is Natalie, although my hair seems to have turned white. Strange. I'm sure it'll go back to its normal, natural pink by the next video, but for today I'm a disciple of greed, because I'm going to be answering one of the biggest questions that basically everyone who hasn't read the Greed Ifrit story, Kazaneru, has about the events of the first half of ReZero Season 2. What would have happened if Subaru did make a contract with Echidna? Now this question is exactly the topic of the Greed If, which deviates from the normal ReZero story at that crucial decision we saw Subaru make near the end of the first core, and so that's the topic of this video. However, so that I can give anime-only fans a good picture of what the Greed If world is like without spoilers, I'm going to be structuring this video quite differently to my Ayamatsu one, and to other videos about the Ifrits that you might have seen. So it's not going to be a beginning to end telling of the story, but a character by character look at how things are different, with a few characters sectioned off in a spoiler section you can skip if you want to. And then a general conclusion about Subaru and Echidna, and what we learned about the world where they're contracted together. You see, the trouble is, this Ifrit isn't structured like Ayamatsu, the Pride If, which I already made a couple of videos about, or some of the others. Instead of taking us through the highlights of the story of Subaru from the point where the what if scenario begins to some kind of ending, with Kazaneru we instead see a day in Subaru's life at a point after the end of this alternate routes versions of events in Arc 5, in which we learn from his interactions with different characters around Roswell's mansion just how different things are in a story where Subaru has a contract with Echidna. Arc 6 as it is in the normal route wouldn't happen at all in this version of events, but there are references to it. And so this story is best read if you're up to date with the web novel or the Japanese versions of the light novel, or it's full of things that will either spoil you or make no sense. While the spoilers and references to Arc 5 and 6 aren't that serious, given that things happen in such a different way in this version, that they're nothing like canon Arc 5 at all. Important parts of this story are full of stuff that really only makes sense if you know the whole of Arc 4, which makes it hard for anime-only fans right now who are curious about what a Subaru and Echidna team-up would go like. So I'm going to try and present it as best as I can for you guys to be able to just skip one part if you're avoiding spoilers, and well, I hope you enjoy it. I will need to mention a bit of lore that hasn't been revealed yet in the anime relating to the Dragon Volcanica. I can't really put this in the spoiler section without having to leave one of the most interesting points about Echidna out of the anime-only part of the video, and so I decided to leave it in because it doesn't really spoil anything about the plot to know it, but I'm just warning you in case you're in the camp of not wanting to know anything at all spoilery, that there is that lore detail in the anime-only part of this video. Please give this video a like and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content. I have plenty of ReZero stuff on the channel, including readings from the web novel and theories, as well as stuff about other anime, including my current series playing through the original Higurashi When They Cry visual novel, as well as some reviews. I'm really desperate to get to 1000 subs, so I'm being extra greedy and begging for them before the main content today. Come on, make a contract with me by hitting the subscribe button. What could go wrong? But enough of that, let's break down the ways things are different for the characters Subaru interacts with during a day at the mansion in the Kazaneru Greed Ifrit. The characters in the non-spoiler section, whose situations I think I can describe without spoilers from beyond episode 13 of season 2, will be Subaru, Reinhard, Beatrice, Roswell, Ram, Otto, and Elsa. To talk about some of these, I will have to talk about an ending to Arc 4, but this story splits off from the normal route basically just before the end of the first core of Season 2, so nothing that I'll be saying happens in the rest of Arc 4 in this story is what happens in the normal route, and I think I can describe what we know about Kazaneru Arc 4's ending in a way that won't spoil anything at all about the normal route. You already know the challenges Subaru has to face in Arc 4 if you're anime only, and the way he overcomes them here with Echidna's help is nothing like what we'll see happen now he's rejected her in the main story. Then there are a few characters who I'm afraid have to be in a skippable spoiler section, and those are Emilia, Garfield and Rem. You can safely watch Emilia and Garfield's sections if you've finished Arc 4 or are watching this after all of Season 2 has aired, but for Rem it's best to have finished Arc 5 if you don't want spoilers. I'll also be talking about the Sin Archbishops in Rem's section. Echidna herself will be covered in the conclusion after the spoiler section, and I'll read you some of her parts there too, so you can get a feel for how she interacts with Subaru when he's contracted with her. I know this is a really convoluted introduction, and apologies for that, but I really wanted to make this a video that allowed anime-onlys to get as much as possible from the Greediff, considering how interesting the premise of it is to people right now, and this structure of video that needs a bit of explaining at the start was the best approach I could really figure out. But now, if you're ready, let's start with the first character, who I'll be talking about in spoiler-free terms, which is Subaru himself. Obviously, he'll come up a lot in all of the other sections too, so the spoilery stuff about him I'll bring up in the appropriate part of the video. So, Kazuneru begins with Subaru waking from a dream, in which he's thinking about how he has died literally millions of times. We see that he's become such a veteran at returning by death at this point, which is 2 years after the start of Arc 4 in everybody else's timeline, but presumably an unimaginably long time for Subaru and Echidna, that he has a ritual he does when he wakes up to confirm where he is and his condition, and kind of ground himself in the present. He's in Roswaal's mansion, but we learn later on that it's actually a different mansion owned by Roswaal to the one we saw before, which somehow burned down in the events of this alternate routes Arc 4. Subaru then washes his face, and we get a rare one of those character looks in the mirror and describes themselves scenes, which are usually a cliche from bad first-person YA romances, but in this case, Subaru is thinking about how practiced he's become at looking like he feels a different way to how he does, to smiling and hiding the fact he must be completely exhausted. Next, we see him have his first meeting of the day with Echidna, which is part of his daily routine too. Now Subaru is contracted with the Witch of Greed, he has a pendant with a black stone which he can meditate on and have his consciousness transported to Echidna's tea party, which is where she always stays, and which looks the same as it did in the anime, like a Windows XP desktop with a witch in it. When Subaru comes here, he's outside of space and time, and so he can spend as long as he wants here discussing things with Echidna, which we can assume comes in handy when he's in a bad situation, like being able to hit pause and consult with her. But for these daily meetings, it feels like she wants him to stay and chat, and he just wants to get on with his day. It is a part of his contract that he must greet her by drinking a cup of the good old bodily fluid tea when he arrives. I'll get to more of the details of things Echidna says in this story in her section at the end, but while we're focusing on Subaru, it's important to know that Echidna is able to communicate with him inside his head when he isn't at the tea party, and that she can watch him all the time. She says that she isn't so vulgar as to want to watch him when he's taking a bath and things, but also says it would be foolish to think nothing bad could happen to him at those vulnerable moments, kind of implying that she does watch him whatever he's doing. Subaru isn't happy about this and says he will remove the pendant when he's using the bathroom from now on. This interaction is quite telling. Subaru has not become so reliant on Echidna in spite of it all that he's afraid to be without her, if it means losing his privacy, but Echidna, the Witch of Greed, naturally wants to see everything he can give her access to in the real world. I think we can gather from the fact he's bothered about her seeing him in the bath, and his reaction to something Emilia does later on, that our Subaru hasn't taken Echidna up on her offer to let him use her body when she offered him the contract. It definitely doesn't feel like in all of the countless time they've spent together, that sort of development has occurred in their relationship. Sorry guys, but I didn't write it. Subaru is as devoted to Emilia and Rem as ever and seems to treat Echidna as a necessary evil, knowing her very well by this point and not trying at all to humour her or give her anything more than he has to comply with the contract. Echidna wants him to stay, but Subaru goes back to the real world, when the next person he sees is Petra. Petra's existence in this story is important, but we don't find out anything about her that is interesting or different from what we could expect in the main story, so I haven't given her her own section. She's still a maid, she's 2 years older, blossoming into a beautiful girl, and of course she still has a crush on Subaru, but he thinks of himself as her big brother. She's his personal maid because it seems Subaru isn't a servant at the mansion anymore, but lives like a noble, a position he apparently decided he wanted and worked to get at some point in this route's version of things, presumably using Echidna's guidance. As we'll see later, he's pretty well allied with Roswaal in this If route, so that's probably got something to do with it. Petra tells Subaru she's going shopping and wonders whether the storm clouds outside mean it will rain or not. This is the usual peak fascinating stuff we expect Petra to say, but actually it ends up being important here. Now Subaru goes around the mansion and runs into various characters, and through the interactions he has, we learn about some of the things Subaru's done since his contract with Echidna began, and get an idea of the kind of strategies he's been using, as well as how things have changed for other people as a result. I'll go through each character one by one, but the overarching thing we discover in terms of Subaru is that it's become his real sole goal to make Emilia the ruler. This is because Echidna's convinced him that making Emilia ruler will give him access to the blood of the dragon Volcanica, which in ReZero's setting, and this is true in the canon route too, is something with powerful magical properties, especially for healing, that the ruler who has a contract with the dragon gets to use. Echidna's convinced Subaru that the dragon's blood is the only viable way to solve the other problems he has in terms of saving everyone he wants to save, which I'll be vague about until the spoiler section, even though from things we see in the canon route, this doesn't seem to be the case. There are other options, and the Subaru without Echidna explores them, but these are options she's kind of shut down by convincing him they won't work. This seems a bit odd for the witch who wanted to try everything in itself. Now, Subaru doesn't have to kill the dragon to get the blood. The dragon just gives some of it to the ruler. So this doesn't entirely align his goals with Roswaal, given we know from season 1 of the anime that for as yet unexplored reasons, Roswaal wants to kill the dragon. But since Roswaal also wants to make Emilia ruler as part of whatever his main plan is, we have basically Subaru under the guidance of Echidna, focused on making Emilia ruler and getting to the dragon, his only other concern being that nobody he cares about is lost along the way, and Roswaal, under the guidance of his gospel, which comes from Echidna, also trying to make Emilia ruler and access the dragon. It really seems like there was more to Echidna wanting to guide Subaru than just his return by death being a way to feed her endless curiosity, considering she's manipulated Subaru into aiming for the exact same thing as Roswaal was being guided to aim for by her book. And we see from how she talks to him when she's trying to persuade him that this is the right path, which the author describes more than once as poisonous, that she has manipulated him. We even see her outright lie to him in the Beatrice part, which we'll come to soon. So, after Subaru has been around the mansion a bit, he comes to find Elsa. We'll get onto why she's there in her section, but she works for Subaru in this version of things. Elsa's been out and is reporting back to him, and Subaru asks her basically whether that storm Petra was worried about ever came. Elsa tells him that it stayed sunny, and on learning this, Subaru surprises Elsa by asking her to cut off his head and make it painless. As his hired assassin, Elsa does this, and Subaru dies, thinking that it will be a terrible mess for Petra to have to clean up, perhaps showing us that he still thinks about the possibility of those worlds he saw in the Trial of the Present existing after his death, but that he's just so used to that idea now that it doesn't stop him from even the most unnecessary deaths. And this is about the most unnecessary death imaginable. Subaru wakes up at the start of the same day, and after his morning ritual goes to check with Echidna what the date is. They talk about his save point, and it's speculated on that the save point being on this day probably means that Subaru is about to be put in danger or challenged in some way. Now this is quite interesting because, without spoiling anything, with Subaru focusing only on the royal selection in this route, what we know as Arc 6 wouldn't happen, and if things that are going to happen in Arc 7 and so on end up being consequences of Arc 6 or other things that didn't happen in this route, it's even possible that in this route, Subaru will actually bypass a lot of things, and what we see here could even be the calm before whatever the actual endgame of ReZero is, or at least an endgame Echidna wants. We can't possibly know, but it will be fun to look back on this when more of the story's been written and see just what in Tappei's planned timeline of events might be about to happen here. Nonetheless, a key thing about the interaction between Subaru and Echidna here is that she thinks he died experimentally, just to confirm when his save point was, but actually that wasn't the real reason. And then we find out what, to Subaru, the point of this death was, as we see Petra come to his room, just like in the past loop, and talk about the weather, to which he's able to reply to her that it will definitely stay sunny. Now, we'll come back to Subaru again in the other sections, but that's the frame of this story. Subaru's looped an unimaginable number of times in the past 2 years, and in his interactions we see what he's achieved by doing that, which we can make our own minds up about whether it's any better than what he manages to do without Echidna, both for him and for the other characters we see, though in almost all cases except Roswaal and Elsa, it really pretty much isn't. And who was rooting for a happy time for Roswaal, honestly? We also see Subaru's state of mind about Return by Death, returning just to tell Petra the weather, not being certain his save point has updated and so potentially losing 2 months of progress. It seems like he's trying in his own way to stay true to what he was always doing this for, to use his power for the people he cares about. It's also almost a small rebellion against Echidna, who doesn't understand at all that he didn't just do it as another experiment around his save point. So, now let's go through the characters in order of when Subaru talks to them in the story, and talk about how their lives are in the Kazaneru route. One of the first characters Subaru runs into as part of his morning routine around the mansion is Reinhard. I won't say what he's actually doing because it relates to something that will be in the spoiler section, but what's important is why he's there. Because in this route, Subaru has actually recruited Reinhard to the Amelia camp. So how did he do this when we know Reinhard is Felt's knight? Well, it seems that over countless attempts involving a lot of trial and error, many loops ending with Subaru actually becoming Reinhard's enemy and being killed by him, or at least so it's implied, Subaru managed to convince Felt that she didn't need to participate in the royal selection at all, which we know from season 1 she wasn't all that into. And he's helped her to run away with Old Man Rom to Kararagi. That's another country in the ReZero world, neighbouring Lagunica, the one that Anastasia comes from, where everything's kind of Japanese and people have a Kansai accent, which seems to have been founded by someone like Subaru, who was isekai'd from Japan. He then managed to get Reinhard to join Amelia's side, and it seems that the events of Arc 5 were, in this version, pretty much resolved by having Reinhard's help. This is something that, if you've read Arc 5, is quite interesting. Subaru feels some guilt about the situation while he's talking to Reinhard, who is clearly not as happy as he was in the main story, and who's deeply troubled by the fact that in his eyes, Felt rejected him because he was lacking in some way. But Echidna's voice in Subaru's mind kind of cajoles him, telling him that Felt is happy now and that it's all okay. Subaru is also somewhat paranoid that Felt might return one day and he would have to stand against Reinhard as an enemy. Now, getting Reinhard to join the Amelia faction is no doubt about the biggest win Subaru could achieve in terms of strengthening her camp, and it was done in a way that didn't harm Felt, who probably genuinely is happier this way. But there's just this sense of wrongness about the whole thing from Subaru, that he's clearly pulled off some massive manipulation that took what would have been endless years of work in his time, and while he's got what he wanted, and what's best for Amelia's chances in the election, it feels sketchy to him. Already we can see that Subaru's been completely focused on the Kingmaker role that Echidna's convinced him will solve all of his problems, and so he's doing all this little finger stuff. But now Subaru says goodbye to Reinhard, and with Echidna's words failing to make him feel any better about things, he goes to see the next character, who is very interesting, and that is Beatrice. As I said earlier, the original mansion burned down at some point in Arc 4 in this route, and that caused the Forbidden Library to be destroyed. Subaru managed to get Beatrice to leave with him rather than dying in the fire by basically doing the same thing we saw Roswaal tell him to do earlier in Season 2. That is, telling Beatrice he was that person, the person Beatrice was told to wait for. Now what's interesting here is that because the Kazaneru route happens if Subaru agreed to Echidna's contract when it was first proposed, the scene where Subaru interrogates Echidna about Beatrice and learns that that person doesn't exist never happened. Subaru knows that he lied to Beatrice by saying he was that person, but he also still thinks that that person actually exists. And when he asks Echidna who it should have been, perhaps because he thinks that finding them might help get Beatrice out of the despair she's in this route, Echidna tells him that there is no way to find them, and no reason to find them either, as the knowledge would have been in one of the books destroyed in the Forbidden Library. So yeah, Echidna straight up lies to Subaru about something we see him learn the truth about, just moments after this route deviates from the normal one. This, combined with the fact she's clearly directing him towards the same thing she's directing Roswaal towards, so definitely has an agenda beyond just wanting to watch Subaru out of scientific curiosity about the outcomes of different experiments, tells us that, well, a contract with Echidna is not the mutually beneficial alliance it might have been taken to be, but more like Echidna gaining Subaru as a pawn. Beatrice's life was saved by him lying about being that person, but her spirit is completely broken. She spends her time cowering in the library of this new mansion, which is just a normal library, and which she can't hide the location of with her door crossing. It's said that she's lost her prideful dignity now that she no longer has the duty of guarding the library she was contracted to, and she's now certain that Subaru could not possibly have been that person. We know from season 2 that Beatrice can't commit suicide, but it seems like that's kind of where she is. She tells Subaru that it's not her resentment that's supposed to vanish, but herself. Subaru feels terrible about this. Beatrice scratches him when he tries to comfort her, and he tellingly refuses to get the wounds healed. But Echidna basically tells him that he should just keep going, and Beatrice's mood would improve eventually, giving him some where there's life there's hope type spiel. She also acts as though the loss of the knowledge in the Forbidden Library is a huge regret for her. Incidentally, we do also learn that Subaru tried thousands of loops to rescue Beatrice without doing this, but there was no way to do it and still save everyone else. If you're watching this after all of season 2's been aired or you've read Arc 4, that's pretty interesting. After Subaru leaves the library, having gotten nowhere with Beatrice, he next encounters Roswaal. Roswaal stops Subaru while he's just walking around the mansion, and it seems Subaru doesn't really want to talk to him. Roswaal's pretty much the same, only in this version of events where Subaru's completely dedicated himself to making Amelia ruler, and he's achieved so many things that are helping with that, Roswaal is a lot more pleased with Subaru than we see in season 2. He knows about the same amount about Subaru's abilities, in that he knows Subaru can redo things but doesn't know about return by death, and he doesn't seem to know Subaru's contracted with Echidna, though we don't know what his gospel has told him. Subaru seems to know less about Roswaal than he would like to though. Roswaal still talks about Amelia becoming ruler being essential to him achieving his dearest wish, but he's refused to tell Subaru what that wish is, saying that the choice to know that is no longer available to him. It seems like Roswaal thinks Subaru needs to not know Roswaal's goals to fulfill his role in helping to achieve them, even though Subaru does tell him that if he would only tell him, he might be able to help. It seems like Subaru has accepted that Roswaal will keep putting him into difficult situations in order to force certain progress towards the goal they both share, but that he will also lend him his strength, which it seems he did do in this route's version of Arc 4, helping him save the villagers from the Great Rabbit. It's unclear whether Subaru's found out about Roswaal's gospel in this route, where that happens after him rejecting Echidna in the normal route, but that could well be tied to Roswaal saying that he lost that choice. So yeah, Kazunari Roswaal is as shady and mysterious as Arc 4 Roswaal, and seems just as likely to cause bad things to happen that Subaru's forced to deal with, but he's much happier with this Subaru. This Subaru doesn't like him any more than regular Subaru, but then even Ayamatsu Subaru didn't really like having to ally with Roswaal. Poor Roswaal. Next we see Ram, and I'll just kind of summarise how she is because I'm going to talk about Rem in the spoiler section and I don't want to allude to any of that in the anime only part. Due to her devotion to Roswaal and the fact Roswaal acknowledges Subaru as an important asset, Ram acts completely differently now, basically treating Subaru with a kind of professional respect, like a normal maid would treat an important guest. but also like he's someone she has no particular relationship or friendship with. Subaru doesn't like this, and much preferred when she was normal around him. It's kind of sad to see, and serves as a good example of what friendships and relationships Subaru's losing out on. Yes, everything seems to be going right, broadly speaking, under Echidna's guidance, but Subaru is lonely, with only Echidna's constant company, and all of these deaths and the role he's playing now has basically caused him to be separated from the people he wanted to save, with these strange, stilted kind of relationships with them, where everything's kind of okay, but there's no colour to it. Next, Subaru goes to see Emilia, but I can't talk about her without big Season 2 second core spoilers, so for now I'll skip that scene, and you can choose whether you want to watch it in the spoiler section, based on whether or not you finished Arc 4, or, you know, whether you just don't mind the spoilers. So after that, we see another thing that shows us quite clearly the important friendships Subaru's lost in this route, and it comes in the form of him being shaken by a memory he recalls quite often, and that is the memory of Otto leaving him and the Emilia faction. Otto, in this version of things, left Subaru's company to go off and do merchant things after the events of this route's Arc 4. He said in his goodbye to Subaru that he was leaving because he saw that Subaru was trying to handle everything himself and didn't want anyone's help, and because he saw that Subaru would do all he could to protect those who were close to him. He said that by removing himself from that number, he was returning Subaru's favour of saving him. His last words to Subaru were, "I thought of you as my friend, you wouldn't have thought that though." Echidna suggests, as Subaru remembers this moment from a year ago, that we're told he continues to dwell on regularly, that the reason Subaru didn't try to stop him was that it was a blessing to him to have one less person to protect. But Subaru says she's wrong, and that he just respected Otto's intentions, since he was someone who didn't have any reason to stay and help the Emilia faction anyway. Subaru acknowledges that Otto's divine protection that allows him to talk to animals was useful, but not indispensable to winning the election, again showing that the election is the only campaign Subaru sees himself as being on here. He believes that if Otto had stayed with them, he would never have left, and sees this as trapping the man who he only knew for a couple of weeks, when his debt had already been repaid. This pretty much shows that while Subaru did act in what he thought was Otto's best interests, rather than in a more manipulative, Roswell-like way of keeping him around just because he might be of some use, in this version of events he never really came to understand Otto, and that what Otto really wanted was just to be a good and reliable friend. This Subaru doesn't have any good and reliable friends. He just has Echidna, and a bunch of people he's trying to stop from dying, with no longer any regard to what they actually want from their lives, and he's quite miserable because of it. This is something we'll see more of from the Emilia scene, but I'm saying it here with Otto because Emilia will be in the spoiler part. And now Subaru is going to meet the last person on his little tour, and is going to die at her hand, at his own request. Yeah, it's the character who manages to be weirdly likeable in If Roots, Elsa the Bowel Hunter Graniet. In this version of events, Subaru somehow saved Elsa when the mansion was burning and offered her a job. This seems weird given why was the mansion even burning if not as some kind of result of Elsa's attack on it and whatever Subaru must have done to stop her, but given Roswell is a lot happier with Subaru in this route, perhaps he did have a way to strike a deal with Elsa. In any case, Subaru has managed to get Elsa's help, and the main thing he has her doing is going out spying to get some information about the witch cult. It's also said that she can prove useful when someone needs to get their hands dirty. But Subaru says that when he hired her, he told her there might come a time when he would ask her for something strange, and when that happened, she was to listen to him. This seems to be because he's been using Elsa as a handy way to die when he needs to. After his death here, he says to Echidna that Elsa is always surprised when this happens, which he finds amusing, and so he's clearly done this a lot of times. I find it kind of messed up that contracting with Echidna, something that he knew would mean he would have to die millions of times, didn't come with the promise of some kind of painless suicide pill or something. Surely Echidna, the best scientist and inventor of the ReZero world, would have a recipe for something like that, and it would be a big help to the poor guy. But no, he had to make his own arrangements, and with Elsa, he knows she will follow the order. When he asks her to cut off his head and make it painless, she does seem to comply, so it seems Elsa does follow the orders of the people she works for, rather than giving in to her sadistic side and disemboweling him painfully as we've seen her do normally. We don't, incidentally, find out what Mei Li is up to in this route, or whether she survived the mansion. So, now it's time to go back to 3 characters Subaru encountered earlier in this story in the spoiler section. The first part of the spoiler section is safe if you've finished Arc 4 or if you're watching this after the end of Season 2. And then there will be another chance to skip the REM section, which contains spoilers for Arc 5 and some talk about Arc 6, though it doesn't really reveal any more about Arc 6 than you'll know at the end of Arc 5. So, if you're anime only and watching this video when it was made, after only the first core of Season 2, then skip now to the time shown on screen to go straight to the Echidna part and the conclusion. Otherwise, keep watching for Garfield and Emilia, and then you'll have a chance to skip again before REM. Subaru encounters Garfield at the same time as Reinhard, near the beginning of the story. Reinhard is actually training Garfield, which to Subaru means that there is what he describes as a massacre going on every morning as they fight. Reinhard has a high opinion of Garfield's potential, but at the moment Garfield is nowhere near strong enough to trouble him, and so their fights are both a source of frustration to Garf and an outlet for his general rage. But what's Garfield mad about? Well, in this route's Arc 4, Garfield was never truly brought onto Subaru's side. He stayed wanting to remain in Sanctuary until the very end, but Subaru and Roswaal basically found a way to isolate him from everything, while Subaru completed the trials and broke the barrier, and then evacuated everybody else. They then saved Garfield from the Great Rabbit. All we know about how the Great Rabbit was dealt with in this route is that it was driven away. Perhaps, again, something that Roswaal might have helped with, given he's a lot happier with Subaru in this route, and so clearly worked with him a lot more in Arc 4. So the Great Rabbit is still alive in this route, where of course Subaru wasn't able to gain Beatrice as his contracted spirit, and Emilia, as we'll see, doesn't go through the changes she does in Arc 4 either, and so wouldn't be in control of her powers to fight usefully. Garfield, like Emilia, doesn't get the growth he does in normal Arc 4, and while he respects Subaru's strength for what he was able to achieve in the Sanctuary, he also really resents him, and is generally just full of rage and bitterness about the way the Sanctuary situation was resolved. It's stated that he only joined the Emilia faction at all because of persuasion from Frederica and Ram, who of course work for Roswaal. Subaru doesn't come to ever really get Garfield in this route, and he's more or less depending on Reinhard to take care of him. As an aside, all we learned about what happened with Ryuzu in this route's Arc 4 was that Roswaal managed her. But now we come to Emilia, and there's quite a lot of important stuff here. As I already said in Garfield's section, in this route Subaru completed the trials and removed the Sanctuary's barrier. In the web novel, Echidna said in her monologue trying to convince Subaru to contract with her, which was heavily cut down in the anime, but which I have a video reading the full web novel version on my channel if you want to hear the whole thing, that he should do this immediately after contracting with her, so I'm guessing that's what he did in the Kazunari route. Contracting with her would probably mean she'd deem him to have passed the trial of the present, having accepted the idea of returning by death as many times as it took, and so he'd only have the trial of the future left to do. We only see Emilia do this in the normal route, but I think we can assume that of the trials, it wouldn't be that hard for Subaru, or probably even that different from Emilia's. This means that Emilia is basically left permanently in the state of having taken but failed the trial of the past. She's only seen the trial that she would never have been able to overcome because it was based on false memories where her real ones have been suppressed. That is, she sees the memory where she's hated by the people of Elior Forest and was responsible for freezing it by losing control. We know from the normal route that Puck can't communicate with her when she's like this, and there's nothing to indicate Puck has come back to her in this route, though he won't have broken his contract with her either as he does in the normal route. So basically, Emilia has had 2 years of being in this crazy and unstable state with no idea why Puck won't talk to her. And Emilia is very unstable here. We see that when she gets even slightly angry or upset when thinking about Beatrice, the air around her begins to freeze, and Subaru warns her that if she doesn't calm down, Reinhard will come. It seems that Emilia's emotional state can and has brought the deep freeze, and that Reinhard is basically Subaru's plan for if that happens. Emilia is not said to have changed or grown at all in the last 2 years, and she acts sort of halfway between normal Emilia, halfway between crazy kiss of death Emilia, being very clingy with Subaru. He gets his hand caught in the door at the start, which Emilia responds to by sucking on his fingers, which naturally gets Subaru quite flustered, but then she starts wiping it off and going on about her drool like a little kid. Emilia has also cut her hair short, which I guess is to try and look like Fortuna, but possibly also a rebellion against Puck, who had it as part of his contract with her that he chose her hairstyle and styled her hair. What Emilia is doing with her time in the mansion is studying. Subaru has her studying so that she'll be able to be a good ruler, and she does this diligently, but it seems more because Subaru told her to than anything else. Echidna still hates Emilia as much as ever, and we get the sense that she's been bitching about her in Subaru's ear for all this time, this ridiculously long amount of time that's passed only for Subaru and Echidna. It still makes him angry to hear it, but he can't argue when Echidna comments that it would be more convenient for him if Emilia was just a doll who did whatever he wanted. He knows that in his way of protecting everyone in this route, he's basically trampling on their own wishes and freedoms just to keep them alive. And he also knows he's accepted that this is what he's doing, because it won't stop with just Emilia. Just like Beatrice and Garfield, the lack of the resolution they got to their own problems as a result of Subaru dealing with everything in the sanctuary himself means Emilia can't move on as a person at all, and will probably never get the answers about her own past that she needs. She's just being raised to be a king, and a king who will be completely dependent on the people who backed her should she win the royal selection and rule. We know from remarks made by other witches in the web novel that Echidna has a history of meddling with powerful people, not always with good results for the people who sought her help. And so we have an Emilia who is basically mentally a troubled child, being set up to rule by Subaru and Roswaal, both of whom are, in different ways, under the direct influence of Echidna. And now I'm about to start talking about Rem, so if you are planning to skip this part, which has spoilers from beyond the whole of Season 2, then go to the time on screen for the Echidna section and the conclusion. So, in this route, 2 years on from her name and memories being eaten by Leibat and Kaitos, one of the Sin Archbishops of Gluttony, and yes, this is a spoiler section, so I can say that there are 3 of them, Rem is still in her Sleeping Beauty condition, just as she is post-Arc 5 in the normal route. However, where at this point in the normal route, Subaru plans to go to the Pleiades watchtower and find the sage, who he still believes is called Shaula, to try and find a way to cure Rem. In this version, Echidna has persuaded Subaru that the only way to save Rem is with the blood of the dragon, meaning that making Emilia ruler will, as a consequence, solve this problem too, and causing him to be even more focused on that objective. Now, there's something really interesting here. Subaru in the normal route thinks that what he needs to do to save Rem is to track down the Sin Archbishop of Gluttony, and this is his only real lead on saving Rem before Anastasia, who is at that point actually possessed by an artificial spirit who has Echidna's personality but none of her memories, suggests that there might be a way to make it to the Pleiades watchtower and ask the sage who lives there for help. Something this separate Echidna type spirit wants to do because she says she wants to find a way to give Anastasia her body back, and which the group that ends up going to the watchtower also wants to do to save people who were eaten by gluttony or turned into grotesque creatures by lust in Arc 5. This is what basically sets up the expedition that is Arc 6. This, it seems, doesn't happen at all in the Greediff. It's said in the Reinhard part that the attack on Pristella was resolved with no casualties by Reinhard, so there are no fly people to save. Anastasia presumably never has her body taken over by her scarf. Man, I bet this sounds so weird to anyone watching this for spoilers who hasn't read Arc 5. And Subaru also most likely has no idea that the scarf is even a spirit. In Arc 5, Anastasia opened up to him about this because he too is a spirit user, which he isn't in this route, and because the witch cult demanded that the artificial spirits, Beatrice and Anastasia's scarf, were handed over, a demand they probably never made in this route, given Beatrice wouldn't have been there, and they may not have had an opportunity to make any demands anyway if Reinhardt was able to stop things before they took the city hostage. In that route, Subaru was hoping to find Gluttony, and 2 Gluttonies, Roy Alphard and Lebat and Kaitos, the one who ate Rem, do appear in Pristella, along with all of the other remaining Sin Archbishops. Now, in this version, the witch cult's attack on Pristella was for some reason different, in that no Gluttonies showed up. And indeed, nobody has any idea where the Sin Archbishop of Gluttony is, or has been since the Rem incident. It's actually this that Subaru has Elsa going out looking for clues about, and she's found nothing either. Just like in the normal Arc 5, the witch cult attacked the city of Pristella, and somehow, just like in normal Arc 5, Regulus Cornelius, the Archbishop of Greed, was killed, and Sirius Romaniconti, the Archbishop of Wrath, was captured. That all ended up the same, despite the tactics Subaru and his allies must have used being totally different. But the Gluttonies never showed up anywhere. Echidna keeps telling Subaru that chasing after Gluttony is pointless because he'll never be able to find them, and if he does, he won't be able to make them tell him how to save Rem. But this is weird because Subaru has Elsa, he has Reinhardt, and he has infinite tries. If he wanted to make someone talk, there's no reason to think this would be impossible, and it would seemingly enable him to get Rem back far sooner than going by the Dragon Blood method, which means waiting for the royal election, which was 3 years away when Rem was eaten. It's understandable that Subaru is still trying to pursue this using Elsa, even though Echidna tells him that making Emilia ruler is the only way. But why has Gluttony gone into hiding in this route? There's a year time skip between the end of Arc 4 and the witch cult attack on Pristella in Arc 5, and while in the normal route, Subaru doesn't die at all in that time, and the Emilia faction mainly spends it training, relocating to a different mansion, and generally becoming closer. It seems that in this version, Subaru was doing whatever it was he was doing to meddle with Felt, and who knows what else. And so under Echidna's guidance, he was doing a lot of different things and dying a lot of times. Did Echidna have him do something that would inadvertently send a message to the witch cult that Gluttony needed to hide away? Or alternatively, did Roswaal do something? In this version of events, Roswaal's gospel will not have been taken away from him, so he'll still be acting in accordance with it, and we can assume he has ways of inciting the witch cult into certain things. So it could be because of Roswaal's gospel that Gluttony didn't show up in Pristella, and has been impossible to find. If either of those things are the case, it's because of Echidna, so why does she want Gluttony kept out of Subaru's way? Is it because she wants him focused only on the royal selection so badly that she needs Rem's condition to keep motivating him towards that? Or is she scared of what would happen if Gluttony used their authorities on Subaru while he's contracted to her? If the latter was the reason, it seems like something she could just tell him in some way, maybe not explaining what she's scared will happen, but just telling him it could kill him permanently or something, and so him meeting with Gluttony needed to be avoided. Instead, she seems to have gone to great lengths, not only to persuade Subaru he really does only have the Dragon's Blood option to save Rem, but also to make sure the route he's still tempted to take of pursuing Gluttony won't work for him. It's very, very suspicious. So with that, that's the end of the spoilers and speculation about the Rem and Gluttony situation as it is in the Kazunari If, so it's time to wrap things up by talking about Echidna herself. Welcome back if you skipped to this part to avoid the spoilers. Here is where I'm going to be looking at a few points about Echidna that weren't covered in the previous sections, before finishing off with a quick conclusion about what the Greed If really means, in terms of the decision Subaru made in the normal route not to contract with Echidna. Echidna, in her way of talking to Subaru, hasn't really changed at all from how we saw her in Arc 4. She still has moments where she plays the cute card and tells him she's just a young maiden and flirts with him, and moments where she talks about her own nature as a witch and how she would lose face if Subaru didn't let his guard down occasionally. In his first meeting with her at the start of the story, they do in fact reminisce about what she said to him when they first met, about how most people immediately vomit in her presence, but Subaru did not. And yet, we see that now Subaru knows Echidna a lot better, knows things he doesn't like about her at all, like her view of Emilia. He seems more annoyed by her, more weary of her ways than grateful or impressed. I've talked about all of the odd, awry things that Echidna seems to have done in this route and the points where she lies or reveals, at least to us who have seen how things work out without her, that she isn't truly exploring all of the options and seems very geared towards driving Subaru's motivation in only one direction, making Emilia the king. But the scene that the Kazunari Greed If story ends on is Echidna alone, watching Subaru return back to the real world and giving some of her thoughts, which now seem once again to be back to the premise that Echidna wants Subaru to sate her unending curiosity, where everything else in the story has suggested she's actually working toward a more specific goal. These things aren't really at odds, of course, because Echidna's the Witch of Greed. Perhaps it would be strange for her to only want one thing from Subaru, but it certainly keeps us guessing about what she's really up to when all's said and done. And here, I'm just going to read you out the closing paragraphs of the story because I think her words are important. Using one's own life to save them, to protect them, to keep someone from them, contributing it thus. How virtuous, how noble, surely deserving of everyone's exaltation. Furthermore, not just the once, but challenging an endless cycle of hardships, is the impression it can't help but give. Pressing her hands to her chest, the witch considered the boy with whom she'd had a contract. Desperately seeking his ideal, pressing onward despite being struck endlessly by reality, possessing that most wretched power of return by death as his own, all in order to love someone. However, dedicating life to return by death, to protect one's own surroundings, is a double-edged sword, too disdainful of one's own life, too stubborn about the value of other lives, because the value of one's own life can no longer be seen. The lives of those precious others become too desperately consequential. This time, anything that isn't the lives of those precious others aside is unseeable. That is downright. No matter when, no matter where, that singular attitude of clinging to what could absolutely not be scoured was downright foolish. You truly are someone who can satisfy me. Cheeks reddened as if a maiden in the throes of infatuation, the witch longed for the absent boy. Through the crystal gemstone he crossed the gate, bringing absolutely everything of the world into her palm, and when the afflictions and hardships shattered him, every time, he unconsciously came to rely on the witch. To keep his spirit afloat, enduring the temptation of a witch, even if he became a marionette. In order to merely check the weather, adapting a mentality which was unhesitating to use return by death. Even that had gone unnoticed. But I want you to rest assured, the lives of those you prize, I will also wholeheartedly gamble my very wisdom on protecting them. So for this, you too, to satisfy this inexhaustible curiosity of a witch, I want to continue as your accomplice. Suffering and unreasonable fate from now forth would equally descend endlessly upon the boy. Though the hardships be arduous, though the heights be insurmountable, the boy with the witch's aid, lending one another strength and wisdom, found themselves able to cross. Presented by the Witch of Greed was that love of scorching flame. Ah, even so. The boy crossed the grand gate, the boy sprinted to offer protection. The boy's guardianship bore fruit. Feeling many scarred hearts resulting from the boy's protection, the witch sighed. A proposition that would remain sempiternally unresolved, and yet an enigma that would eternally enthrall her, even in death. Ah, even so. Why does love always fade? Novel readers will know this isn't the only time we see Echidna think about this question, and it's a question that's used by the author as kind of a motif for Echidna's personality. To me, it means that in Echidna's mind, love is tied to novelty. Her obsession is with gaining new knowledge and information, but it's not because she thinks when she knows everything, she'll be satisfied. Indeed, she actually has an easy way to know everything already, which I won't go into here as it's not mentioned in Kazuneru and hasn't been brought up in the anime too much, and she doesn't use it. She has endless curiosity, and it's as much of a problem for her to feel satisfied as it is for Daphne, who has insatiable hunger. The satisfaction she feels when she discovers something is fleeting, because when the question's been answered, it no longer matters, and she's curious about something else. What Echidna loves is not people or things, but anything that's interesting, and no one thing or person or situation can be interesting forever if you're actively working to reveal every one of its mysteries. Here, Echidna is still feeling the satisfaction of new discoveries through her contract with Subaru, but she knows she's no closer to feeling truly content or satisfied, because each thing she's passionate about loses its interest as soon as it loses its novelty. Just like Daphne's hungry even when she's just eaten, and knows even while she's eating that she'll be hungry again right after, Echidna knows she'll never find peace, because the feeling she loves will always fade. I don't think Echidna is talking about love of the kind other people feel in this setting. For instance, I don't think she's talking about Satella's idea of love, but she's talking about her own experience as the Witch of Greed. This inability to be satisfied that's most obvious in Daphne, but is present in all of the witches, is really the burden they all share by having their obsessions and fixations, and I think we see it in the archbishops too. When you devote yourself to a sin, maybe you're walking a path where there will be no contentment and no rest for you, even in death. So, to make some kind of conclusion about the world where Subaru forms a contract with Echidna, well, basically it's like the Game of Thrones, only instead of you win or you die, you win or Subaru just dies again 100 million times until you do. Whatever it is Echidna truly wants, she's guaranteed to get it with basically infinite tries through Subaru, and while Subaru's capable of understanding that he shouldn't always trust her, the things she's not telling him, the things she's lying about, and the alternative ways things could have gone where characters like Emilia, Garfield and Beatrice would have been happier but also harder to control, that she clearly never suggested, are things he can't possibly know. Subaru's in a position where there are now really only two ways he can go. He either keeps on like this, with his increasing unease about everything, probably learning all too late that whatever it is he's been helping Echidna to do all this time isn't something he would have wanted to be on board with, or he has to somehow defeat Echidna or dissolve their contract, which, well, how does one even begin to do that with somebody who's watching you at every moment, can communicate with you by telepathy, and is also the smartest person who's ever lived? We don't see how this route ends. Some of the if routes, including Ayamatsu, do show us the full story of that route's Subaru and the bad end that results from the if scenario, but in this case it would probably be impossible to write that until the ending, or at least a lot more of the normal route is known, without spoiling all kinds of stuff. But it does tell us enough to know that there was more that Echidna wanted Subaru to contract with her for than just the chance to experiment and see otherwise impossible things. It does tell us that so far Subaru made the right choice in the normal route. However, just one final mystery to leave you with. In the interlude scene, partway through Arc 4, where we see the witches just after Subaru leaves, having rejected Echidna, and I've done a reading of this scene in a video if you haven't read it, which you should check out if you're curious about the witches because it wasn't in the anime, we get the strong impression that the other witches know that Echidna actually intended for Subaru to reject her, and potentially even baited him into it. If Kazuneru shows us Echidna using Subaru to reach some unspecified goal of hers in the real world, one would think that the only person this route is best for, other than Elsa, who loves an if route, would be Echidna. And yet, it strongly suggested that she actually expected and even wanted Subaru to turn down her offer of a contract. So what does that mean? I'd love to know what you guys think about all of this, especially Echidna, who becomes even more mysterious and difficult to understand basically every time Tappei shows her to us. But that's all from me for now. Thank you so much for listening to all of this. I hope you found it interesting. Please give it a like, and please subscribe if you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon.